great majority of language learners never actually achieve the C level at all. Your active ability to utilize the language most certainly will not. You have to go out of your way in order to actually achieve an active ability, C level ability in the language. If you're interested, if you'd like to improve your German, then please do come stop by and check it out.
Hi, everyone. I'm super happy to have a very, very special guest. And his name is...
David Allen Martin II, or just David, also fine.
So David is, first of all, a fantastic guy, but also one of a kind when it comes to speaking foreign languages. And that's the reason why I invited him here. We've been talking about collaborating for, I don't know, how long? It's been 2 years, many years, eons. And there is also a surprise for you, a surprise in store for you at the very end. So you might want to sit down, give the video full attention, take a bunch of notes, and let's get into it.
First of all, thanks for having me, and it's great to finally be here talking with you, Luca, live. I'm from San Diego, California. I'm a very passionate language learner and language instructor. I've been learning languages for more than 20 years now, and living in Germany for most of that time, with the exception of 1 year in China and 2 years in Spain. But I come from relatively humble linguistic beginnings. I grew up speaking only English, and it wasn't until later in life that I discovered the joy of learning foreign languages. I did, however, at a very young age, begin loving my own native language, English, and reading in particular. And I think that's what kind of sparked my interest in languages in general. Yeah. That's the kind of the short version, I would say. Professionally, I wear a few different hats. Finally ended up achieving my dream of founding a company based on teaching people to learn languages more efficiently and especially more enjoyably. It would have been 6 years back now with both of my brothers who are software developers, and we essentially transform my language learning methods into software, which we then provide to students to help them to learn languages faster and have more fun in the process.
You were saying that you finally fulfilled the dream of creating a company, and that's great. I think the cool thing is to share the knowledge and the experience that you have when it comes to learning how to learn a language. It's meta learning, because people have all the tools, all the resources nowadays, but they still lack sometimes the know-how. How do you learn a language? And I can tell you guys that David knows a thing or two about learning foreign languages. Is there a particular event, a person, or an experience that sparked your interest, that spawned the language monster in you, so to speak?
That's a great question. And funnily enough, I've told you this before, but you and Steve Kaufman actually were among my, I would say, earliest inspirations in terms of seeing, and Richard Simcott as well, both of whom you've obviously had on your show or your channel multiple times. I would say the three of you are those individuals who inspired me, earliest on, and also the early days of YouTube. This would have been 2007, 2008, 2009. Thereabouts. And I didn't actually know that such a thing as a polyglot existed. Certainly not in
this mythical creature.
This polyglot. I distinctly remember watching, your early videos. I believe you lived in Spain at the time, and you were just chatting away in French and Swedish. I remember those. And Dutch, for that matter, and I've just been blown away by the fluency, and in particular by the pronunciation, because I've always been fascinated by phonetics and phonology, and I'm known as a lot of the times as, hey, you're that guy from California who speaks perfect German, right? Whatever that means. There's no such thing as perfect anything. We know better than most, but being able to pass as a native speaker, even if briefly, is a considerable achievement, right? And so I noticed that kind of knack. Later, I learned that it was, because of dedication in your case, in Richard's case, in Steve's case. And so that kind of, it definitely provided me with further impetus to become an even more, let's just say, successful or broadly, and now I'm thinking in German here, breit aufgestellt, like having many languages under my belt, so to speak. Yeah, so that was I would say the earliest inspiration, and then it kind of went from there.
Thank you. First of all, it's always nice to hear that I inspire someone around the world, and in particular, a person like you, David, who's just a fantastic polyglot, and once again, a fantastic person. I noticed that sometimes German words come to the fore. when it
Hmm.
comes to when you speak English. And this happens to me being a native Italian speaker. Sometimes I have a hard time speaking Italian when I have to express certain things within certain fields in Italian, because English comes to the fore. In my case, I know for a fact you lived in Germany for 20 years. Can you tell us a little bit about that? How did that experience shape you linguistically and also culturally?
It wasn't until I was 16, 17 in high school that I started with German. And I really enjoyed German because we focused not on grammar, but on really entertainment value. We focused on having fun. We listened to the Beatles in German. Many people don't know that the Beatles actually recorded or re recorded a lot of their songs in German.
Didn't know
Sometimes
that.
the
Interesting.
lyrics are, you knew that?
No, I did not know that
Ah,
actually.
okay. Yeah.
So
Well, there,
I
there you
should
have it.
listen.
Yeah.
I'm a Beatle fan. So I
Yeah.
want to listen to them in German
And
as
sometimes
well.
the translations are interesting because, for example, the song I Wanna Hold Your Hand in English was translated as Komm, gib mir deine Hand in German. So slight modification, but their pronunciation was pretty solid. And the songs, I mean, they're well-known songs. They're fun to listen to. We also watched short films, and the focus was more on communication. And so the language kind of came alive for me, and also because I had an instructor who, as I said, didn't really focus as much on grammar, but rather making the language kind of real and authentic. And that really, kind of had a lasting effect on me, I would say. In addition to the fact that when I started learning German, I actually learned that English is not a Romance language the way that I thought, but rather a Germanic language with Romance influence. And that was when I first started to get interested in linguistics and historical linguistics, etc. And I would definitely say that my passion for my own language, which I mentioned earlier, kind of was fuel for the fire to then, delve more into Germanic and Romance languages later on when I actually studied linguistics at university.
Excellent. So I know, because I've seen you in action in Germany and Poland, all across Europe, that you speak a lot of languages really well. And what I mean by really well means very fluently. And top of that, with native-like pronunciation, German, but also other languages. I recently I watched a video of yours speaking Dutch.
Vandaag heb ik weer een video voor jullie allemaal, deze week in het Nederlands. Ik beweer niet dat ik perfect Nederlands spreek, maar ik wilde jullie allemaal op zijn minst een idee geven van hoe de Nederlandse taal klinkt en een beetje praten over mijn persoonlijke motivatie om Nederlands te leren.
And I was verbaasd, so I was quite surprised of how good your pronunciation in Dutch is.
Aber ich wollte auf jeden Fall auch mit Jack auf Deutsch sprechen, weil, wie gesagt, er spricht hervorragendes Deutsch, bei dem man eigentlich gar nicht denken würde, dass du kein Muttersprachler bist. Könntest du ein bisschen
Bei dir
darüber...
auch nicht. Ja.
Aber bei mir weiß ich das. Ich bin das aber nicht gewohnt, andere Nicht-Muttersprachler des Deutschen, vor allem Muttersprachler des Englischen kennenzulernen.
And also, you speak a bunch of languages. Can you tell us a little bit about how many languages do you speak, and what is more or less the level in each language?
Well, German is the kind of the most obvious one to start with, I would say. And as I said before, I mean, when I go and I hit the streets in Germany, people think I'm German.
I know.
Invariably.
I can tell.
If anyone notices anything at all, it's generally that they think, well, he's German, but he spent a long time outside of Germany. And so, because I will sometimes throw in English expressions or whatever, obviously a lot of English is used in German. There are a lot of Anglicisms, although oftentimes the pronunciation is closer to British English than it is to American English. But sometimes I'll just kind of throw things in there, and it throws people off because they think, well, he's German, but he sounds really American when he speaks English. Like I said, little kind of inconsistencies, but you notice those also with Germans who have lived in a foreign country for a long time. I have a friend who's been living in the States, a German friend who's been living in the States for 20 years, and he has a slight American accent when he speaks German. I mean, look at Arnold Schwarzenegger, right? He also has So these kinds of things, and I'm sure that you're aware, many people, as many other people as well, those kinds of things come up. But the point is, if you manage at all to make anyone think that you're a native speaker, even if only briefly, that in and of itself is already a considerable achievement, right?
Yeah,
because some people, they open their mouth and within 3 seconds, you already know that they're a non-native speaker. And so for me, it wasn't always, I never really said, I want to be perfect in German. I just wanted to sound as authentic as possible. because out of, I would say, kind of respect and love for the language and for pronunciation in general, but also because the better your pronunciation is and the more authentic sounding it is, the easier it is to communicate with people because they don't have to they're not strained to understand you. And so I kind of come at it from not as much a egocentric perspective, but rather
Narcissistic, not a
exactly from a
narcissistic.
narcissistic perspective, but rather one of simply wanting to be able to communicate with people more effectively. And so at some point I realized that, the things that I had discovered in terms of being able to work on and improve your pronunciation, that most people are not aware of those things. And then I started to systematize that knowledge and, kind of turn it into a science. And that's now what I teach. So then beyond German, because that was the kind of the first language that I achieved a very high level in, Spanish would have been the next one. I moved to Spain, lived there for 2 years. Very different experience learning Spanish because German I had studied before I moved to Germany. Spanish I hadn't studied at all, except for the one semester in the 6th grade or 7th grade. So I got to Spain and no formal knowledge of Spanish. ¿Dónde está el baño? And me gusta la cerveza. Those were the two phrases that I knew, and that was it. But I already knew a great deal about learning languages at that point because I had already learned German to quite a high level in the year and a half that I was there initially in Germany. So I basically just started getting comprehensible input every single day, watching TV as much as possible, all the things that I did, to successfully learn German, and then just trying to speak as much as I possibly could and consistently try to use new words in my active vocabulary. And then eventually ended up up till now, I've done a C1 exam just prior to starting with my translation studies, my master in translation studies that I did later on. I did the C1 in Spanish. I haven't taken any additional exams, but I think I could pass a C2 in Spanish. And I do sometimes pass for a Spanish native speaker, depending on who I'm talking to. And once again, I don't like to talk about these things because I'm not attempting to be braggadocious, but it's simply the case. I have been able to pass off and I know that you're familiar with this predicament, if you want to call it that, my pronunciation as being native in Dutch as well, and in French and Italian as well.
Buonasera a tutti. Oggi volevo fare un breve video in cui vi dica la mia esperienza con l'apprendimento di italiano, visto che ho cominciato ad imparare la lingua alcuni mesi fa e non ho mai fatto un video in italiano prima.
That doesn't mean that I sound like a native speaker if we were to talk at length in Italian, you would notice right away, right? The point is, what is it that you need to do in order to improve your pronunciation to that point that it sounds that authentic? I would say after Spanish, I speak Chinese probably the best.
我的名字叫 David， 我是一个来自加州的英文跟德文老师，也是翻译。我会说的其他的语言包括荷兰语、法语、意大利语、西班牙语、瑞典语和波兰语。我现在在学习俄语。
Chinese or Dutch. Both of those are rustier than they were when I was actively studying them. Recently, Dutch has actually gotten a lot better because many of my clients, I would say most of my clients, are now Dutch speakers. Dutch-speaking physiotherapists learning German because they want to move to Switzerland. That's a lot of my clients.
It's a very specific niche.
Very specific niche, yeah. But they need it, and there's a growing group of individuals with that particular background. And so I've been improving my Dutch actually on a daily basis now, just to be able to help them to more effectively learn German. And then I would say after that, probably Italian, which now I probably actively speak at a B1 level, but I definitely understand well nigh everything that I hear. So passive, I would say it's definitely the C1, if not C2, depending on the particular text. Obviously, mostly thanks to Spanish. And then beyond that, I've studied Swedish pretty intensively, Polish for quite a long time, although that's active.
Cześć wszystkim, jak się macie? Dla tych z was, którzy nie wiedzą, nazywam się David Martin. Jestem amerykańskim tłumaczem I nauczycielem angielskiego z San Diego w Kalifornii.
Probably completely gone at this point. I mean, there's some things are still there, but anyway, I've studied quite a few languages. I kind of have a command of them at varying levels, I would say. The languages that I speak the best, I would say, are German, Spanish, Chinese, and Dutch, most definitely. And I use those on a weekly basis for sure in my kind of my job. as an instructor, as a language coach.
Excellent. So you got an impressive profile. Well, I already knew that, but people do not know. Maybe one day, if you guys want, just write in the comment section. David and I can engage in a multilingual conversation for you to see, David. Maybe this could be interesting for people. We're also gonna do a live, and you will see this live next week, because this video is coming out. We're recording this video, and then we're going to have an excellent, pretty sure it's going to be an amazing live about how to move from B2 to C1. So stay tuned. I'm going to put the link in the community box, and this promises to be fantastic. It's not just going to be about how to move from B2 to C1, which we're going to talk about also today, but also how to get a native-like accent, because you got the expert here.
Im heutigen Video würde ich gerne auf Deutsch reden, da ich in den letzten 2 Videos auf Spanisch bzw. im anderen Chinesisch geredet habe. Aber vorab würde ich mich gerne denjenigen vorstellen, die mich noch nicht kennen. Mein Name ist David Martin. Ich komme aus San Diego, California. Ich bin Linguist, Übersetzer, Dolmetscher und Experte für Fremdsprachenerwerb.
David is going to show you some nice tips and tricks in order to get native-like pronunciation, because I believe that everybody can do that. People might be wondering, hey, David speaks a bunch of languages. What does your typical language learning routine look like when you start a new language?
Yeah, I mean, one of the reasons why I kind of was initially attracted to your work in particular, Luca, was because I saw that systematicity in terms of your approach to learning. In fact, early on, as far back as I can remember, I was, reading your original blog, Polyglot's Dream, I believe it was called.
Yeah.
If I remember correctly.
Yes, good old times. Yes,
good old times, and I loved the fact that you shared quite a bit, and Steve Kaufman does this as well, about your kind of thought process behind what it is that you do. I have met many very successful polyglots who don't really share their methods, or sometimes they just don't have a method, and that's perfectly fine. They simply use whatever they can find, and they kind of figure it out, but they don't necessarily share their philosophy. And so that insight was very helpful to me, and I realized that there were other people who basically spend all day thinking about how languages actually are learned and what happens cognitively in the brain. When I first started learning a language, my approach used to be quite a bit different. I would just buy a book. For Dutch, for example, I bought Teach Yourself Dutch, and I'd actually just listen kind of around the clock to the audio before I ever even read a single word. I would just listen while I was working out, and just to acclimate myself to the sounds of the language. Obviously, especially when things start to stick, or rather when they're repeated a lot, then they start to stick. But one thing that I realized was that there was a lot of frustration involved, or I would say associated with not understanding. And one of the problems that we have as adults is that we get bored rather quickly, and we want to understand everything, right? Children are kind of much more forgiving in that sense, because they're much more willing to accept vagueness, things that are unclear, and when they don't understand 100% of something, they don't really get bent out of shape about it, as we would say. And so I very quickly realized I want to understand as well as possible, but I need to be exposed to authentic, especially audio materials. So those can also be video materials, but the important thing is the audio, because if I'm not exposed to the audio, then whenever I start speaking, if I put more time into reading than listening, when I start speaking, I'm going to speak and also subvocalize with something that is artificial. It is not the actual language the way that it's spoken by native speakers. So I need to have the audio, and I also need to be able to understand. And what I very quickly realized was that if I had the audio and the text in the foreign language, let's just say Spanish, for example, then I could translate that. Now, back in the day, that was Google Translate, which was not great, but it was enough. It was enough to help me to understand roughly, let's just say 80 to 90%, and that's all that you need. So I would repeatedly listen to the foreign language audio, and I would read along in my native language, in English. And that was the beginning of my language learning method, which is now an app, Translation Cubed, which involves exactly that. So essentially what I do is I translate, and I know that you work with translation as well. I translate both at the sentence and at the word level. And that way I can understand not only what is being said, so the intention of what is being said, but also how it's being said. So one of the examples I like to give is Ich verstehe nur Bahnhof in German, which means I don't understand a damn thing, or I don't understand barely anything at all, if anything at all, right? But it literally means I understand only train station. So I need to have both of those translations to truly understand that phrase in German. Ich verstehe nur Bahnhof means I don't understand anything, or I barely understand anything at all. But what it's saying is I understand only train station. If I have both of those things right away, when I then also listen to that phrase, I have a very deep understanding of how to say that phrase and how Germans think when they actually try to express that particular thought. Now, and then if I extrapolate that over many thousands of sentences where I'm always understanding exactly what's being said at the sentence and at the word level, I start to very quickly, even as a complete beginner, gain an intuitive feeling for how the language is actually spoken at the kind of logical, at the word level, at both the word and the phrase level. Does that make sense?
It does make sense, and I was just jotting some notes because I have so many things to say, and I want to play devil's advocate and ask you a few questions about this. The first one, and you can elaborate a little bit on that, is the fact that a lot of people tend to think that translation is a bad thing. You hear it all the time. You should not translate. You should just listen to content that you can understand, comprehensible content, and then immerse yourself in it, and then you're going to get better and better. I think comprehensible input is important, immersion is important, but when it comes to comprehensible input, the main difference, as far as I'm concerned, and then I'm really eager to hear your opinion, is that especially if a language is very distant from yours, so let's consider, for example, an American Mark, right, who wants to learn, say, Spanish or Dutch, for that matter. Let's consider Dutch. Dutch is a very close language, so you can immerse yourself in Dutch and maybe slowly understand things. And I'm just referring to the fact that you can, let's suppose the Mark is just listening and reading in Dutch, comprehensible input, things that, for example, he reads a text and things are explained. This is a very slow method, but it can work. While if Mark has a bilingual text or can create a text himself, and as you were saying, he not only sees the sentence, like sees the translation, meaning how the sentence, the meaning is conveyed in another language, because translation is the art of conveying the equivalent version, but not necessarily the literal version. And on top of that, you have the literal version. Then you have all the information you need in order to understand the content as quickly as possible. That's the first thing. So my first question to you is, what do you reply to people who say, no, you should never use translation because it's bad, then you're going to translate for the rest of your life, and this bad habit is going to get ingrained in your brain, you're never going to get rid of it? First question. Then I have another one.
I had that question when I presented T3 Translation Cubed at the Expo Lingua last year.
Yes.
That's where we met in 2019. So Luca and I met at the Expo Lingua 2019, and last year I had the pleasure.
And we liked each other immediately. We did,
indeed, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt.
I mean, it was a surreal experience for me because I felt like I had already known you for 12 years when I actually finally met you. But absolutely, yeah, we hit it off quite well immediately. But last year I had the opportunity and the honor of representing LinguaThor, my company, and Translation Cubed with my own stand, along with my brother at the Expo Lingua. And I was also the moderator of various panels. And I also had the opportunity to present T3 to a larger audience. And one of the first questions I got was specifically that one that you just posed. And what I say to that is that when you truly look at the T3 method the way that I profess it, the whole point of T3 is to get away from the translation as soon as possible. So what you do is, rather than it being a bottom-up method, it's a top-down method. What does that mean? That means you start by understanding everything, and then you wean yourself off of the translation. And you do that by combining the two-level translation, so global comprehension or comprehension of intention, which is the sentence level, and then word level decoding. When you combine those with the audio and you repeatedly listen, eventually you no longer need the translations because you just understand the foreign language audio. And if you do that, the more often you do that, the less often you will need translation at all. And at that point, that's when you start to only focus on the third level of translation in T3. That's why it's called T3, which is what I call active reverse translation, or ART, where you're actively translating your native language into the foreign language. but you're doing it using the word level decoding. So to use the example of I understand only train station. The German is hidden, and I have to retranslate understand only train station back into German. But because the words that I'm seeing are German grammar or represent German grammar, I'm actually not building the bad habit of translating literally from my native language. Because if I said, I don't understand, I don't understand Jack, as we would say in English, or I don't understand a dang thing, right? Then I would I would try to say something like thing or whatever, because I would say that in English, in German, but that's not how a German would express that thought. Translation is good as long as your goal is eventually to wean yourself off of it. And that's exactly the way that I designed Translation Cubed, to promote precisely that.
Fantastic, David. The thing is that everything you said, that's exactly what I do. It's surprising how, like, we've talked about this at length, but it's surprising how we've come to the same conclusions. And the method that we use is very, very similar. The principles are the same, because I always talk about principles being universal, but the methods that we have developed independently are extremely similar. Now, there's a couple of other things I wanted to say. I know we don't want to go off a tangent, but we're really passionate about this. I really like education. I like learning how to learn neuroscience, and this is all combined. The first thing that I would say, I'm just taking a look at all the notes of the notes of the notes. So this is getting longer and longer. The very first thing that I want to say is that you hit the nail on the head when you're talking about the fact that you want to wean yourself off from translation, meaning that translation is a tool. Translation is a tool. It's like when you look at let's consider, for example, a hammer. Take a look at a hammer. You can build a house. You can build something, a wall, a house, whatever. And you can also kill someone. So translation is literally a tool, and you can use it in different ways depending on what your goal is. As a beginner, the way you use it, the way I use it, is just to use translation, to use your native language or any other language you have under your belt in order to facilitate the comprehension of a foreign language. You're decoding a foreign language at a word level, at a sentence level, so syntax level, by using a language that you know, either your native language or a language you know well. You do it maybe for 3 months, and then once you get to let's say a critical mass, I like this concept, like to use a physics jargon, critical mass or language core, whatever you want to call it, you got a clear understanding of the structures of the language, sound structure, syntax, and that in and of itself is going to allow you to then acquire a language naturally, because now you have all the means to acquire a language. Now, interestingly enough, this is called the weak interface hypothesis in linguistics. We've been talking about this for quite some time recently, because Stephen Krashen talks about this CI, comprehensible input. And the weak interface hypothesis is called weak because it just basically says you use your deliberate knowledge as an adult in order to then acquire a language. This work that you do facilitates the acquisition of a language. And the other point I wanted to make is the fact that you can use translation at different levels. Now, you call it reverse translation. I call it exactly the same. I've never talked about this on YouTube, but at a higher level, onwards, and after going to attending a conference interpreting school in Paris, I created this method, which is probably very similar to yours. Maybe we do it in a different way, but I use, for example, articles. It depends on the kind of language you want to develop, and then I tell a person who's got a very high level, let's say a B2 in French, just an example, and then I ask him, hey, take this article in English and translate it into French. Then they have the article in English, the article in French, and they can test themselves. And you can see how they're amazed at the gaps they have. Like by translating, you're forcing yourself out of your comfort zone. You can test, you can do this with a tutor, you can do this by yourself. But just to demonstrate that translation can be used in very creative ways if you want to. It doesn't get in the way of speaking the language. Sorry if this was a little bit verbose, but I wanted to chime in because what you said just when you think about it, just blows my mind how similar our methods, methodology, strategy, and whatever you want to call it, how similar they are. The one thing that I'm really curious about, though, is the following. You said that you use translation, TQ translation or T3 translation, the translator. So your method, again, people are going to leave all the links in the description box. You're going to find everything in there. does a fantastic job. So you should definitely check this out. I tested it myself. Turkish with Greek, it's great. One concept that I want to explore with you a little bit more, and I'm pretty sure that people are interested in it, is the Goldilocks zone, or the zone of proximal development. So for those who don't know the concept, basically, if you're using material and you're doing things in a way that feels too difficult, you get discouraged. If you're using stuff that is too easy, you get bored.
Mhm.
But you said that you start by using your own method in order to tackle texts from the very beginning that are authentic. That was my understanding. I might be wrong. So you don't
That's
take,
correct.
let's say, Teach Yourself or Assimil or things for beginners, which contain good content. The content is good, but also the language is really kind of not robotic, but is really watered down so that they speak like this, and then it doesn't sound natural. So my understanding is that you get content that is already at a certain level. It's kind of authentic, and then you just decode it with your method. Is that my understanding? How does it work with the Goldilocks method? How do you choose content that is authentic but also good for beginners, so good for your level as a beginner? That was my question.
That's a great question. So it entirely depends on the language in my particular case. If it is a language that is entirely foreign to what it is that I'm already familiar with. So let's just say Turkish, since you already mentioned that, which works quite well in T3, as you've seen yourself. And the great thing about it is that you import a text and immediately get the translations, which you wouldn't even be able to come up with yourself. Because the Turkish is so foreign, it's unlikely that I will be able to maintain a certain level of interest if I, for example, choose a text from, I don't know, Euro News, which I don't know whether you've used before, but you can read essentially European or Europe-related news in many different languages. So definitely all of the main European languages, they usually have the same articles in many different European languages. So if I were to, for example, import a science article in Turkish, then I would definitely be able to understand everything, because that's the whole point behind the T3 app, is that you can import the text and get translations at the sentence and word levels. But it's so foreign in so many different ways that I might still feel overwhelmed in terms of my ability to relatively quickly move from not understanding to being able to understand that audio. So for a more foreign language, I might choose things that are simpler. I still try to find more authentic materials. That is to say, things that don't sound canned. How are you? I would like to buy 3 apples. The kinds of things that, we're all familiar with from some of the series that we've perhaps used in school or at university. So I need to have some kind of story. I don't like when it could be a mini story or mini dialogues, but there should be some type of interaction. If it's just random sentences or something that doesn't really feel like it has a story to it, I personally get bored. I know some people who learn quite well with those things, and I certainly do not intend to poo-poo that. Whatever works for you is fine. What's important is that you maintain your level of interest, and that only works if you choose materials that are interesting for you. I generally like to learn with YouTube videos these days, because it's just, you have the visual aspect, the audio aspect, and the text aspect, and so that keeps me far more entertained. The problem is sometimes, or I would say half the battle, or in Germany you say die halbe Miete, half the rent, is finding materials that you actually enjoy. I would say that's one of the most difficult things about learning a language is getting out there and finding good materials, especially ones that you can kind of use extensively. And I'm sure that you, as a coach, a large part of what you do is provide interesting materials to your students. It's certainly a large part of my job as a German coach.
I help
So
them.
so
I
yeah.
help them. Sorry to interrupt you. The only thing
Oh,
is that I
please.
help them figure out ways to find content. I can provide content. We have an extensive vault for people, for example, who take our courses, extensive vault
I like that.
across a lot of languages, but still you have the paradox of choice that we have so much that people get lost. And you
This
made
this is
an
true.
excellent point, that you have to remember that you and I are extremely passionate about language learning. And sometimes we take for granted that a lot of other people are, but some students just learn because they have to learn. Either they have to move to Turkey or learn, like in your cases, your clients, they have to move to Switzerland and speak German, Dutch people. You have to remember that people are lazy, and sometimes it's not as passionate. I'm not saying that everybody is lazy, but in general, there's always a friction in I have to find the material, then I have to do this, then I have to do that. This is one of the reasons why when it comes to the beginning, when the very first 3 months, I always use the same book, Assimil, because it makes my life easier. And I get bored of it pretty quickly after 2 months. Actually, nowadays you can find them. You can create craft your own material from the beginning. You can ask AI to create a story. You can ask a native speaker to read it, or you can even use natural reader to. You can 11 labs. You can do. You can do anything. The problem is that since I know Assimil, I just get Assimil and then I use it for 3 months and then I do exactly what you do. But I just have this window of 3 months, a 3-month window where, hey, I just get Assimil. I know what I'm getting myself into because I've used it, get bored of it pretty quickly. And then I move on to, once I've built a language core, okay, now I can craft my own material. Sorry, I interrupt you. You were saying something.
No,
I'm pretty
please.
sure it's important.
And that's a very important point that you make, that you're using something that you're already familiar with, that you get those, you have that feel good feeling. I know exactly what I'm getting, and I know, and I've had success with this before and it works for me. And if that is the case, then by all means, absolutely do that. One resource that I've used extensively over the years is the Harry Potter books.
Harry
right?
Potter.
And the great thing about Harry Potter is they're essentially at face value they're written for children, but there's a lot of, I would say, more adult themes, and certainly linguistically in terms of the language, it covers absolutely up to a B2 level, sometimes even going beyond that, such that you can and there's so many kind of real life dialogues in there. I mean, there's over all of the books, there's so many things that happen, but also obviously a lot of repetition. Yes, people argue, well, yeah, but then you're learning all this vocabulary you don't need. Well, the great majority of that vocabulary is not vocabulary you don't need in everyday life. And I know you've talked about this before. Any text that you take on any topic, I don't care what it is, 50% of that is made up of the 100 most common words in that language of any text, right? So that's already going to be useful to you. And then if you actually look at over the course of the entire book, the great majority of those terms are going to be, words, verbs, nouns, whatever, are going to be useful to you. So what I did with Harry Potter, in particular in Swedish, this is how I got started learning Swedish. I imported page by page, chapter by chapter, the whole book into T3 and combined it. I bought the audiobook and combined it with the audiobook. So I was listening in Swedish and I was reading along in Swedish and English using T3 and understanding every single sentence, every single word. Eventually, as I progressed through the first book, I started to get to the point, because I would actually always try to listen first and then go. So I'd listen to a chapter first without reading anything at all, just because I wanted to see how much I understand. I did this with Swedish because Swedish is similar to German and Dutch. I would not do it with Turkish. Right? Because I would just get bored because I don't understand anything, right?
Of course.
So you kind of always, I adapt the method depending on the particular language that I'm learning and its proximity to languages that I already know. And I noticed that the more I progressed through the book, the less I even needed the translation, because I started to just understand things without actually needing to go and look at that translation. Now, I still use T3. Why? Because the third step of T3, as I already said, is active reverse translation. So the further I progress, the less I need the first two levels. I don't need it to comprehend. I already comprehend. But I do want to be able to speak. And so by jumping straight to the third step, I actually start to activate more and more of that vocabulary, because I'm having to actively remember the Swedish. And that's why I always tell people, we're like, well, yeah, but I'm already advanced, so I can't really use T3. That's not true. Jump straight to the third step, because you're not a native speaker, which means you don't express all thoughts just like a native speaker, which means you can absolutely benefit from that active reverse translation if you import a text of sufficient difficulty.
Amazing. So thank you, David. And again, the more I listen to you, the more I realize how similar our methods and our strategies and our vision is. Now, I wrote something down. I hope you can see it and everybody can see it. So let's imagine that you start learning a language from zero and you want to move on to a native, right? C1, C2, maybe not native like. And then you have these steps. You have A2, and then you have B2, and then you have C1, C2. For those who don't know, this is like the Central European framework for languages of, you can easily Google it, and you will find different definitions of different levels. Language levels is broken down into these levels. These are labels, but they give us a little bit of a framework. That's how the name is called. So we've talked about a little bit at length, but we could talk about this for hours, about the first step, right? And if I can recap and rephrase, reformulate what you said, you basically start by using translation as a tool. You get stuff you like. You use translation in order to make it really interesting stuff, comprehensible for you, facilitates understanding. And then from, let's say, A2 onwards, you start consuming content, and this allows you to further acquire the language. Now, I want to premise this by saying that we're going to talk about this now, but also more at length in a live show. And once we have both online, you can just click on the link below and you will see also you can enjoy the live show where we will be speaking about moving from B2 to C1. And he and David will also show us some cool slides and how he does it. But I wanted you to briefly talk to me about the famous transition between B2 and C1. Let's see, from B to C, right? What is B? What is a B? What is it to have a B2 level for you? And what is it to move from B2 and to C1 and then C2, and what it entails? No?
Yeah, this is a question that comes up again and again. And the reason is that I would say that the great majority of language learners never actually achieve the C level at all. Would you agree with me in that estimation?
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. And the reason is because in order to achieve a C level, you have to become quite systematic in terms of your approach. It's not enough anymore to just consume, as some people do. That was what I did when I first, as I said, when I first moved to Spain, because I knew that that's what I needed to do, because I hadn't already gathered that experience living in Germany. But at some point, while your comprehension may move into the realm of the C, your active ability to utilize the language most certainly will not. You have to go out of your way in order to actually achieve an active ability, C-level ability in the language. What does that mean? That means that now, of course, the given is that you're already understanding at a C level. And if you're not, then, a large part of that is because you're not making that content comprehensible. And of course, you can use Translation Cube. There are various ways that you can make content comprehensible. Once you've acquired enough of the language, oftentimes you can get to a C without necessarily needing to translate your way to a C, let's just say. But how do I actually start speaking at a C level? Well, I've obviously been living in Germany for 20 years, as I said, with the exception of a couple of years in Spain and one year in China. But just because you're living in a country does not mean that you will ever learn that language, or that you'll, most certainly not that you'll start speaking at a high level. I know people who've been in Germany for 30 years, who've been in Germany for 40 years, and they still barely speak the language. I've met people in every country like this, and I know people who speak at a very high level, but they still have a very thick accent. So the point is, you're only ever going to achieve that which you actually make your objective and then put dedicated work into. And when I say dedicated work, what I mean is that you actually need to put deliberate effort into actually improving. And so what does deliberate effort mean? It means that you're going out of your way, as I said, to expand your vocabulary, expand your ability to use the language with nuance, to use high level, so C level verbs, right? Instead of saying, I don't know, zusammentreffen, which would be meeting in German, you say Konvergenz, the convergence, right? Which to a Romance language speaker, that's just the everyday word that we use, right?
Yes.
But for Germans, the everyday word would be Zusammentreffen, Zusammenkunft, whatever. And Konvergenz sounds very kind of high and lofty, just because it's the Latin term, right? So whatever that happens to be, you need to go out of your way to use those words. I knew a girl when I was living in Spain who spoke impeccable British English. She was Spanish. And I said, why is your vocabulary so large? I mean, it's definitely larger than a great many native English speakers. And she said, well, when I lived in London, she lived in London for 10 years, but once again, that's not a guarantee. But when she did, she said, every day I hit the streets and tried to use 5 to 10 new words that I had learned the day or the weeks prior. And she did that consistently, day in, day out. And it showed. It absolutely showed. So I would say that that's the biggest thing Now, it's not easy if you don't have a routine for a lot of people. That's one of the reasons why I actually recommend that people use Anki. I know you're not a big fan of Anki, Luca, and that's perfectly fine. You don't need Anki in order to do this. And actually now, with the advent of AI and the fact that these AIs, whether it's ChatGPT, whether it's Gemini, whether it's Grok, whichever flavor that you prefer using, they can actually remember every single word that you've ever used in a conversation with them. You can actually have the AI regularly remind you to use new words. What word have I never used before in our conversations that I would need to use if I wanted to have a C1 level in the language? Well, and then it can tell you. I mean, it just blows me away sometimes what is possible with these tools, but obviously
Of course.
we'll speak at greater length about that later. So that's
Yes,
it
we
in a
will.
nutshell, I would say.
Yes, excellent. I just wanted to chime in and just wanted to give my own perspective. A couple of things very quickly. I hope this is going to be quick. So the first thing is you probably heard about the 10,000 hour rule, according to which if you spend 10,000 hours trying to refine some skills, be it language learning, skiing, or playing the violin or whatever, then you're going to get good at it. Unfortunately, that's not true. You have to put in quantity. Of course, it's a lot of hours, but you also have to put in quality. In your case, in your case, in my case, in the case of people who developed very good skills, it's always about deliberate practice. Now, you made an example of that. I just to give you a little bit of perspective, one thing is to practice something, and the level of engagement is really important. So the level of engagement defines the kind of practice you are engaging in, you're applying. So let me give you a very simple example. When it comes to speaking, if you're just talking to someone with a friend, doesn't correct you, you're just using the language, that's practice. You're using the language. Well, if you sit down with a tutor or use AI or use an app that gives you feedback and then you apply the feedback, you jot it down, just to give an example of one of the many ways in which you can do that. You jot down new words or you deliberately try to say things you cannot say, you get feedback and you reapply it. That's deliberate practice. That's what really takes you to the next level. And the third point that I wanted to make is there's a law which is called the law of diminishing returns that most people are not aware of. And this is how the human brain works and also the body works, that once you start doing something, then the body and the mind adapt. So if you keep doing the same thing over and over, then you plateau. Literally, you are not learning anymore, or you're not learning that efficiently. The law of diminishing returns states that when you reach a higher point, you have to put in more effort, because if you put the same effort, you're going to get diminishing returns. So the return of investment is less and less, and you have to adapt to the situation. We're going to delve again. You're going to see another live where we're going to talk about this much more in detail from the point of view of neuroscience, linguistics, second language acquisition, and whatnot. Again, we could talk about this for hours, but unfortunately, our time is limited. Yes, I hope you're enjoying this. And by the way, again, stay here because David is going to show us, he's going to talk a little bit about his academy and how he does this in practice, how he can help you to do this in practice. Let's talk about a couple of other things. We've talked about how to move from, let's say, to start a language from scratch and then move to A2 and then B2 and then C1, etc. Let's talk about accents. We've briefly touched upon accents before. Was genuinely surprised and pleasantly surprised when I heard you speak all these languages, when we were like goofing around at the Polyglot gathering. You speak perfect German, then Chinese, then Italian, then Spanish. First of all, it's a little bit of a provocative question. Do you think you need to have talent in order to speak with a native-like accent or to reach native-like pronunciation in any language you set yourself up to learn? Or is it just a matter of training and mindset?
I would say that it entirely depends on what it is that you mean when you say native-like accent. If you mean that you sound exactly like a native in all cases, all the time, indistinguishable from a native speaker, then I would say that it is unlikely that everyone on the planet is going to be able to achieve that as an adult in a foreign language. However, if you mean that you sound highly authentic, such that people regularly think that you actually grew up with the language, even if you don't speak it quote unquote perfectly, I do think that everyone is capable of achieving that level. The question is, A, whether you have that as your objective, because many people say, well, I'd like to speak better, I'd like to improve my pronunciation, but A, they don't really necessarily know what that entails. And B, if you really dig down deeper, you realize they don't really want to put in the effort that is required in order to attain that level of, I'll call it perfection, but that level of granularity with their pronunciation. They just want to be able to be understood better and sound and make a better impression, let's just say. So first of all, you need to have the will and the desire to achieve that level of, as I said, granularity, that level of nuance and perfection in your pronunciation. And then B, you need to know how to actually approach that. And the great majority of people, including language teachers, do not actually know how to efficiently approach improving your pronunciation in a systematic way. Shall I go briefly into the details of more or less how I approach?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
please do. How do you train your mouth? How do you train your ear? And how do you train other people when it comes to acquiring an accent? Do you do it at the beginning? Do you do it a little bit later? Like, do you act immediately like, hey, you're a beginner, let's focus on pronunciation right now? How does it look like? Again, we're going to talk about this also at length in the live. So barely scratching the surface here.
Precisely, yeah. So overt, I don't do any overt pronunciation training directly at the beginning, because directly at the beginning, what students need the most is massive exposure to comprehensible auditory input. They need to be listening as much as possible to the language. There always needs to be more listening than reading. I mentioned that before. The reason is that if I read more than I listen, then it's highly likely that I'm going to pronounce things and especially subvocalize the way I think that they're pronounced and not the way that they're actually pronounced. I see this again and again with learners of many languages that I have taught, but German, let's take German as an example. The phrase I have in German is ich habe, right? So let's say I don't have any time, I have no time.
Und dann frage ich die irgendwas von wegen, wie war dein Wochenende? Und dann sagen sie, ja, es war schön.
Now, you write habe, H-A-B-E, but almost no native speaker in their daily life ever says habe. They say hab, right? And they don't actually say ich, they say ich. So, ich hab keine Zeit. Ich hab keine Zeit. That's how a German would actually say that phrase. Now, if I learned that phrase listening to authentic German, then I know that, and that's how I would pronounce it. But if I learned it from reading primarily, then I'm going to say ich habe, right? And I hear it day in, day out from learners of German. So that's just kind of one example. But you need to do lots of listening, so you get massive input to authentic materials. And you also need to, once you do start speaking and once you do start focusing on individual sounds, so not just the individual sounds, not just phonetics, but also the phonology, right? That particular case that I just mentioned is phonology. So it's how what those words actually look like combined and in practice. You have this obviously in every single language. In English, right? What are you doing? We don't say what are you doing? What are you doing? Right? So words that bleed together in speech, you need to become aware of those. But one of the most important things is being aware of common mistakes that are made by speakers of your language learning whatever your target language is. So if you're learning English, the average mistake that you're going to make is going to be the same as any other. So let's just say you're an Italian speaker learning English. Most likely, you're going to be making exactly the same mistakes as every other Italian speaker on the planet initially makes when they first start learning English. Those mistakes will be distinct, however, from those mistakes made by German speakers. And within or among German speakers, you have Standard German, you have Swiss German, you have Austrian German. Each one of those different, let's just call them dialects, make their own particular mistakes when learning English, right? Or when learning
Can you
Spanish.
give me an example of American? Can you say a German sentence the way an American would say it? And then I'm going to tell you about how an Italian would say a German sentence or an English sentence.
So in German, something that's very important in German, this also exists in Dutch and most Slavic languages that I'm aware of. It's something that's called final syllable desonorization or devoicing. So what that means is that voiced consonants, in particular voiced plosives, become voiceless. So we're talking in particular about B, D, and G. B becomes P, so B becomes P. G becomes K, G becomes K, and D becomes T, D becomes T. Okay, so let's just take the word which means bath or bathroom, right? So it's written B-A-D, exactly the same as the English word bad, just with a capital B. And your average English native speaker will say either bad or they'll say bad, right? If they know it's an ah sound, then they'll say bad. And they'll distinctly pronounce this, but a German would never do that. The D automatically becomes a T because it's at the end of the syllable / the end of the word. For example, ich bin im Bad. I'm in the bathroom, right? Ich bin im Bad. Okay, that's how a German would say it. So so ich or itch, depending on how the American, to what level, or ish. Any of those things are possible. Ich, itch or ish. Bin im Bad, im Bad. Ich bin im Bad, right? Something like that. So you notice that I automatically start opening my mouth more, and that's because vowels in German are quite pure, and in English they are quite lax.
Of course, makes total sense. I'll give you my own example as a native Italian speaker of an Italian speaking German and then an Italian speaking American English. Italian speaking American English would say, my cousin speaks exactly like that, so I'm not exaggerating. She would go like, hey, I've been to New York and I have to say that it was so beautiful that I want to go back again. She speaks exactly like that. Or and the same cousin, she lived in Berlin and she speaks German well. I'm not making fun of her anyway. But Berlin ist so lustig. Ich habe so viele Leute kennengelernt und ich will zurückkehren. So this is like, it gives you an idea of like she but other people don't care how they're not aware of that, and they just speak foreign language as they were speaking Italian. There's nothing bad with that, but I do believe, David, you and I are advocates for this. I believe that pronunciation is a little bit like a dress. Of course you can you should be proud of your own accent. You should be proud of your nationality. You should be proud of the fact that, if people say, hey, are you American? You speak like you have an American accent when you speak German, or you have an American accent when you speak Spanish or Italian for that matter. It's okay, but people take you more seriously. People understand you better. And I don't know if you agree with that. Sometimes people even think you have a higher level than you actually have. Because your pronunciation is so good, you say a couple of sentences and they go like, it happened to me. I said some sentences with very good pronunciation and people started to speak very fast to me. And I was just a little bit lost because I still didn't have the level. I don't know if this has ever happened to you or some of your students.
It happens to me. It happens to me consistently whenever I start learning a new language, because the more often your pronunciation is consistently good, great, I would say, in all of the languages that you speak, and I'm qualified to make that statement. And so I'm sure you'll agree with me that the longer that you do this and the more languages you speak and the more sounds that you master, the easier it becomes to pick up new ones, right?
Yeah,
you need to kind of establish that base, that phonetic inventory initially. But the great thing is that these sounds carry over. If you already know from French, then you can easily say U in German because it's the same sound, right? There are micro differences sometimes, but it's effectively the same sound, and also exist in Chinese, right? So there you go, boom, right there. I don't even need to learn that sound because I already mastered it from this other language that I know. Right?
Agree 100%. I agree 100%. Is it worth it though? So is it worth pursuing a very good accent? And why? How long does it take? Do you need to work on it every single day on top of listening and reading? What would you advise people to do, when it comes to improving their pronunciation? What should they do? Should they shadow? Do you shadow? Do you just sub-vocalize? What kind of exercise, like training, do you go through? Again,
I do not recommend subvocalization. I almost never recommend subvocalization unless you're doing it, and then you could argue, okay, is that actually subvocalization? Unless you're doing it while you're listening to something and reading along. In that case, you could be subvocalized. You're essentially shadowing without actually opening your mouth because you're listening to the authentic, the native audio. At the same time, that doesn't work perfectly because speaking is a muscular activity. You actually need to train your mouth to be able to make those sounds. Just almost killed the laptop there.
It happens.
Readjust here.
Let's readjust.
When you get a little bit too excited, then
yeah, I understand. That's the reason why I'm away from the computer, because I know that I'm just gonna just hit things around and everything is gonna fall apart.
Exactly. The important thing Now entirely lost my train of thought. What were we talking
I don't
about?
even remember what you were saying. We were talking about the fact that okay, let's start again. I'm
Yes.
going to
So is
re-ask
it
you a
worth it?
question.
Is
Yeah,
it? Is it worth it? Cut out the noise here.
yeah, go back in.
Is it worth it to focus on achieving a more authentic accent? I would say 100% of the time, absolutely. But the extent to which you'd like to take that entirely depends on your use case, on your particular use case. If you do not need to sound quasi-native and you are fine with having an accent, which there's no problem at all, there's nothing wrong with, then that is perfectly okay. If, however, people regularly misunderstand you for reasons of accent, such that it is actually having a negative effect on your ability to maintain relations and communicate with people, then I would recommend that you work on your pronunciation. And the most important thing is that you identify, once again, those mistakes which are most often made by speakers of your language that you're probably making, and then educate yourself on what's going on, and then do specific exercises in order to reduce those things. Usually, it only takes just a few lessons, with me to significantly reduce the accent of my students, simply because I just tell them, for if you're a Spanish speaker learning German, you make these mistakes.
En la glotis aquí. Y suena así. A, a, a. Este sonido ocurre al principio o justo antes de cada sílaba enfatizada que empieza por vocal.
Period. Right? I don't even need to listen to you speak German yet, but then obviously I do. And, there might be a couple that they don't make, but on average, they make all of the ones that I'm already aware of, that I've heard from many other students before. The problem is, if you go out and search for this information, it's very difficult to find. It's very difficult to find anyone who has gone into this with any level of granularity such that they can actually systematically help people to improve. And that's why I think it's so necessary to share this, this knowledge with others, because it can really help people a lot.
Agreed 100%. That's what I've also been doing for quite a lot, an accent coach, whatever you want to call it. And one more thing I wanted to say before I ask you one last question, and then we're going to goof around a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
But then you have an important announcement to make. I just wanted to stress the fact that it all boils down to personal taste. But also, I believe that it's not just language learning that is rewarding. In my case, speaking a lot of languages with a good accent has brought about major events in my life. I'm not exaggerating. Let me give you an example. I made a lot of friends because of this. When you break the ice, for example, I was sitting around the fountain in Santa Maria in Trastevere, which is in Trastevere, just a neighborhood here, just around the corner, where there's a lot of tourists that gather. That was back in the day, 20 years ago, 25 years ago. And I hear a loud burp just behind me. I just turn around and I go like, that was one loud burp. And they went like, "Oh, are you from the States?" There were a couple of Americans, and I made friends with Garrett, who was a very good friend of mine from Philadelphia. Or another time that I was in Prague, and then there were these very free, cute French girls just sitting next to us, and I just turned around and said, "Ah, vous êtes française? Ah bon?" And then we started speaking, and then one of those girls became my girlfriend. So whether it's making friends at work, you never know, right? Every stranger is possibly a friend that you haven't known yet, that you don't know yet. And I can tell you hundreds of these stories from in Russia and America. And it's just amazing, the door. Even if you just said a couple of sentences, or imagine Kato Lomb, this Hungarian polyglot, used to say that language is the only thing that is worth learning, even poorly. So you put a smile on people's faces just by saying a couple of sentences, and imagine if you start speaking with a native sound, native accent, the reaction is amazing. And you know why? It's because intonation, prosody, accent talks to the heart of people. You're not just talking to their head, you're talking to their heart. You know that, David. You've experienced the same things. So we've been talking about this, and I got a couple of spicy questions about about that, about how languages have helped you in your personal life. But before we do that, one last question I want to ask. I had a few other questions, but actually this is getting a little bit lengthy. And again, we're going to expand upon some of these important points later. Are there any myths that surround language learning, or things that you think people generally take for granted? And as Mark Twain used to say, what got you into trouble is not what you think you know, but what you don't know that ain't, when you think you know that ain't so, or something along those lines. I don't remember exactly the exact quote.
Yeah. I would say the greatest myth that abounds is that there is any such thing as a bad language learner. I do not believe that that exists. That's not a thing. There's no such thing as a bad language learner. As long as you managed to actually learn your own native language, and there are very few examples of people who didn't actually manage to learn their native language, then you are a good language learner. You just don't know how to approach learning a foreign language. A large part of what I initially have to do as a language coach is actually psychological in nature, or you could even say it's psychiatric in nature. When I taught English at the University of Göttingen, where I lived for 10 years, and 5 of those years I taught English at the Language Center, and I was teaching business English and scientific English, and I generally spent the first 2 to 4 weeks of any semester convincing a large portion of my students that they didn't suck at languages, as they said, that they didn't suck at English, that they were actually perfectly fine at learning English, but it was the way that they learned, and it was oftentimes the attitude and mentality of their teacher that caused them to think that. I actually had students whose teachers had told them, you suck at English and you will never be good at English. They actually told that to their students.
That
and of
happened to me
course,
as well.
Thereby, there you have it, thereby ruining that language effectively for them for many years. And it took a lot of, as I said, a lot of therapy work, language therapy work from me in order to convince them that that was not the case. It was simply the approach. It was the way that they were taught to learn languages, that they were taught to associate language learning with grammar, with exercises, with rote memorization, with all of the things that can be helpful. They're tools, they're various kinds of hammers, as you said, but they are ancillary. They are supplementary to the real language learning, which is having some type of interaction with the spoken language, which is the language, and the written language is just a pale representation of that, the real language in its auditory form. And so a large part of what I do is telling people, convincing people, showing people, demonstrating to people that they are good language learners. They just didn't know how to approach it.
Agree 100%. Mindset is everything, and people convince themselves, delude themselves into thinking that they're not good language learners, while in reality they are, because we're naturally wired to learn languages 1, 2, 3, 4. But we just unlearn how to do that at school. I know this is a little bit of a paradox, but unfortunately that's true.
Yeah,
okay, so unfortunately, the interview is coming to an end, but you can find more information in the description box in another live. But before we conclude, I wanted to ask David where people can find you, and also about this special thing that is happening this week. So can you please share with us this surprise?
Sure. So in terms of finding me, you can find me on various channels by searching for LinguaThor, LinguaThor. So lingua, like language in Italian, and Thor, like the god of thunder, LinguaThor. Or just by Googling my name, David Allen Martin II. There are no other David Allen Martin IIs. So you'll find all of my channels by searching for either one of those things on Google. On Instagram, my handle is LinguaThor Fluency. And yeah, beyond that, the special thing that you mentioned, Luca, in particular is geared towards German learners, specifically in collaboration with Flemming Goldbecher from Natural Fluent German, who some of you may have seen before. He runs a channel called Natural Fluent German, and he has a podcast called Deutsches Plapper, or German Babble, where he talks about everything German learning, but also just talks about many different kind of everyday topics, presents them very, very interestingly. If you're looking for a good German podcast, I highly recommend that. And he and I, a few months ago, so this would have been in February, we founded the German AI Academy. And the German AI Academy is geared towards helping people use this new technology. After the advent of ChatGPT 2 years ago, the technology has come a long way. And what we noticed was that A, it's incredibly useful, and we use it every single day in our jobs as instructors, but also as language learners. But we also noticed that a great many, or very few people rather, very few language learners are actually aware of all of the amazing things that you can do with AI in order to improve your language abilities. So we decided to systematize the use of AI in order to improve and help people to improve their German. And that's why we founded the Academy. In the Academy, we have a community, a large and growing community of learners who essentially get proprietary prompts from us, and not just prompts, but also many different materials. So we create materials in German for the learners, and we also provide all of the instruction that you need so that you can maximize your benefit. So we don't just use ChatGPT, we also teach you how to use Gemini, how to use Grok, some of the AIs that I already mentioned, how to use other things like 11 Labs, so that you can do text to speech, essentially everything, all of the different tools, how you can use them, especially the coolest thing, and Luca and I talked about this earlier, the importance of regular and immediate and kind of dedicated feedback, right? Deliberate practice and then getting some type of constructive feedback. And the coolest thing about AI is that you can get that from the AI, whether it's writing on your writing or your speaking. And so you have this kind of what I like to call turbo tutor in your pocket all day long, every day. I regularly practice 5 different languages on a daily basis. I'm not exaggerating, using AI. And, I couldn't live without it at this point as a language learner. But,
you can't live without it anymore.
Yeah, I can't live it at all. Live without it at all anymore. But yeah, we're very, very passionate about this, and it's really, really cool. So if you're interested, if you'd like to improve your German, then please do come stop by and check it out. And you're obviously more than welcome to pose any questions that you have about it in the comments below.
Fantastic. And there's a special promotion until what day? There's a special promotion until Sunday,
to the 19th,
right?
From the 2025.
2025. We have to specify, maybe for people who are going to watch this later, there's also a coupon code, a 10% discount that we're going to put in the description box. So you want to check it out. Everything is, again, in the description box, also in the pinned comment. It's worth it if you're learning German. If you want to take it to the next level, it's definitely useful. I've tried it before. It's amazing. It's amazing when you understand how you can use deliberate practice in conjunction with AI. I think it's a revolutionary thing that was not around like 4 or 5 years ago, and now you can do anything you want to, of course, if you want to, which is pretty important.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you very much, David. This has been an amazing interview, and I knew that it would have been very useful for the learners. And I will see you in a week.
Exactly.
In the live.
Looking forward to it.
Yes. So in the live, we're going to talk about,
and for everyone for their attention.
Yes, thank you, David. In the live, we're going to talk about how to move from B2 to C1 and beyond. This is exactly what David is, the reason why David has built this amazing academy, and the LinguaThor and the translation tools. And also we're going to talk about accents. How do you train your accents, right? We briefly talked about this today, and it's going to be amazing. See you guys very soon.
Take care.
That's out.
Ciao.
So let me ask you a couple of questions to goof around, and then we're going to save these. It's going to be rapid fire. So we can include those or not.
Okay.
So David, a couple of questions that normally people don't ask you on camera. Do you pick up girls to learn languages, or do you learn languages to pick up girls?
I would say neither one. Deliberately, but
no, you gotta give me the real answer, not the diplomatic answer. Come on.
Not the diplomatic answer. No, seriously, neither one deliberately, but I will most definitely admit that it certainly does not hurt speaking languages well, in terms of being able to, wine and dine any individual you might be interested in doing that with.
Wine and dine.
Yeah. It certainly helps.
Yes, and then in my place in Italy they say getting laid, but that's a different matter. Okay, any embarrassing moment? Any embarrassing moment to share, or some of the loftiest points in your language learning? So the lowest and the loftiest, like something that happened that was embarrassing, maybe because you made an embarrassing mistake when you were trying to get your point across in a language you still did not master, and some of your loftiest moments, like showcasing your language skills in front of a big audience and people just going like praising you with shower and saying, David is the man. David is the savior.
David is the man.
He's the man.
Well, I guess I'll start out with the one of the embarrassing. I mean, there have most certainly been quite a few embarrassing moments, and part of being a successful language learner is getting over that, getting over yourself, and just accepting that you're going to make mistakes and that's part of the process. But when I lived in Spain and I did my very first language exchange, and this was an attractive girl, and I was trying to tell a story about having gone out with some fellow students of mine, well, actually fellow teachers of mine the night before, and having drunk wine out of what's called a porron, which I'm sure that you're familiar with. But I couldn't remember the word porron. I had just learned it the night before. And so I said, sí, sí, vino de un pollón. And she just about died and said, ¿cómo? You know? And I'm like, sí, 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 de un pollón. Como, and then she's like, no. And I described it. She said, a porrón. And I said, well, what is pollón? She's like, right? And I'm like, and I just, I wanted to just stick my head in the ground and disappear. But after the fact, it was super funny. And this is a story that, it's not the first time I'm telling this story, but it's a super hilarious example of, making something up, it being initially embarrassing, but then it actually being a story that you regularly tell, and it's it's a badge of honor, if you will, that you wear, and you can look back on, and you can have a chuckle, right? And
True.
I think that anybody who has successfully learned languages will have many of these, right?
Of
As
course.
I know that you yourself have as well. And then in terms of doing something where people were absolutely blown away, I would say the very first time that I spoke at length in Chinese in front of an audience, this was when I was studying Chinese at BY, at Beijing Foreign Studies University, 2013 to 2014. I was there, and getting up in front of a crowd who doesn't know you, and then presenting something. It was about language learning and being perfectly understood, being able to understand people's questions and answer them, just because Chinese, even coming from being an already successful language learner, I had already learned German, already learned Spanish to high levels. Chinese is so foreign and so different and known for being a challenging language. That was definitely one of the highlights for me in terms of my big wins when it comes to language learning.
Thanks for sharing.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's amazing how all the experiences you can have, embarrassing, cringy, but also, lofty and exciting and rewarding.
Yeah.
Who's your favorite polyglot? Do you have a favorite polyglot? Apart from me, of course.
A favorite polyglot. I mean,
favorite polyglot because of the approach, because of the skills, yeah.
You know why I am going to say you, and it's not just because I'm we're doing this talk right now, and it's because you exude and demonstrate the kind of consistency that I actually always wish that I had in learning languages, right? I know, do you still do the journal thing where you actually jot down everything that you do on a daily basis?
I do.
I know
it's getting even more obsessive. It's getting even more obsessive.
At some point you had actually shared it, I think, with the general public, in read-only
I did.
form.
Yeah, I did it.
And so I thought that was, just in terms of being a role model to other language learners, but also I looked at it, consistently over the course of weeks, I remember, and just saw the consistency there, right? And of course, you could have just made that up, right? Anybody could do that, but you weren't making it up. And that is demonstrated by your actual skill, which I know better than most because I actually speak many of the languages that you do. So I can actually say that I know that you achieve those levels because you have that consistency, right? And that dedication. So that is, for me, and I regularly tell people, if you want to look up to somebody, look up to Luca because he demonstrates this systematicity, as I said, and this consistency. But it's also because, as I said, from early on, I really like the fact that you got into the more kind of philosophical and cognitive aspects. And, I can remember various things, the language core, as you mentioned earlier, where you were talking about, or rather you had this diagram with different circles. And so you can have, there's various levels of fluency that you can achieve, right? There's home fluency, there's kind of everyday fluency, there's, let's just say, professional fluency, etc., right? And just because you achieve fluency in one of those arenas does not mean that you'll achieve it in all of those. So I think that we definitely have a lot of kind of similarities in terms of how
convergence
we approach this. Yeah. And
Thank you,
so,
David.
yeah. And I'm not saying that just to brown nose because I happen to be sitting here, but rather because it's true. So cheers to you,
Thank
my
you.
friend.
Thank you, David. There's one last thing I want to talk about, and that's changing accents, because we've been talking
Yeah,
about,
sure. If you want to
accents and shit. And I was thinking, we accents and shit, and we do this all the time when we're at the Polyglot gathering. We're goofing around. So I was just wondering, what do you think about the fact that people can change accents within their own language? It's difficult. For example, I'm pretty sure that if you meet a person from New York who says water, it's kind of difficult to imitate, for example, a person coming from Texas or somewhere else. And I know for a fact you can do that. So I was just wondering.
the funny thing
If
is, I actually have family members who talk like this.
okay, so from the
Yeah,
south, like where are they from exactly?
I lived in Texas when I was Texas when I
Oh, you
was a
live in
kid.
Texas. Okay,
Yeah,
okay. Can you imitate, for
and
example, an accent for New York? Take Texas is kind of it's not easy, but it's all around.
difficult. I think it would be difficult for me to imitate an accent from New York without taking it to the extreme. New York, without
Want
doing
some
the most
coffee?
extreme. Yeah, some coffee.
Coffee.
I definitely can imitate aspects of accents, but what I will say about accents in particular is that it's worth it to kind of dabble in accents, especially within any language that you're learning, just because it helps you to focus and to distinguish nuances of all accents of the language that you're learning, right? I remember when I took German cabaret at Berkeley, and I didn't really think about accents at all. I didn't think anything of my instructor's accent. Moved to Germany, learned to speak fluent German, went back, and I walked in the room and I spoke to him. He opened his mouth, and 3 seconds later, I'm like, Sie kommen aus Bayern. You're Bavarian. And he's like, yeah, schon immer. Like, I've always been a Bavarian. But I didn't realize, because I didn't hear the difference between a Bavarian accent and a Northern German accent when I first got started, right? It was all just German. And so getting into accents is definitely a good idea because it will improve your ear.
It's
And
training.
yeah. So I would say that it's most definitely worth it. I'm pretty good with some accents in some languages and less so in others,
And some others. It's
as is to be
normal.
expected. Yeah.
Have you ever been to Scotland before?
Scotland. It's one of my favorite accents.
It's one of your favorite.
I have been to Scotland. Yeah.
It's one of my
Um,
favorite accents as well. Have you ever
yeah.
seen Train Spotting before?
Train spotting. Yeah, I have.
Train Spotting. The first time I watched Train Spotting, I did not understand anything. I was watching it with subtitles, and I said, "What the hell is this language?"
The hell
But
is this thing?
yeah, it's really difficult. The first time I was in Scotland, I was a little bit shocked with the way the people speak. Well, it sounds a little bit between Scottish and Irish, but it doesn't matter. The point is just to play with accents. I think I've always been, I had an inclination and a
Your
tendency
Scottish
of,
accent is solid.
I'm not
It's
sure it's
very
solid, but it's understandable. And that is the most
good.
important thing. We're
Yeah.
just goofing around, but to demonstrate that we love language,
We're
we like
just goofing
talking.
around. Yeah, yeah.
Goofing
I
around in the real sense of the word.
I like to use, the example of Indian English, for example, to help people to understand the concept of retroflex, right? When I'm working on people, helping them to improve their American R, many people have difficulty with the R, right? As in red or car, etc. But they want to, they want to speak better American English. So I get into, because it's an retroflex R, what does that mean? It means your tongue is pointed back in your mouth. Okay, so what are some of the examples of retroflex sounds? I said, well, look at any Indic language, and you'll find a great many retroflex sounds, especially the D's and the D's, right? So then we kind of work on their ability to say Hindi, right? And not Hindi.
Hindi.
Point their Hindi, right? Point their tongue back. And once they
Hindi.
get a better feeling for that, then I say, okay, that's exactly what you're doing with the American R, right? So accents can actually help you to improve your pronunciation in unrelated languages.
Agreed. Okay, and with
Yeah,
that, David, thank you again, and I'll see
my
you
pleasure.
next week.
All right. See you then.
Bye. Ciao, ciao.
Take care. Bye bye.
Okay, let's stop.